The outdoors is sold to us as freedom, open sky, clean air, a horizon with nothing in the way. It is where people go to feel most alive, to test themselves against rock and water and weather, to stand somewhere a screen could never take them. But the same emptiness that makes those places beautiful is what makes them lethal. There is no railing on a cliff edge, no lifeguard on a glacier, no off switch on a thunderstorm. A single misjudged step, a frayed rope, a current of air, and the gap between an ordinary afternoon and a final one closes in seconds. What has changed in recent years is that so many of these moments are no longer private. People carry cameras into the wild now. They film their own climbs, their own jumps, their own last walks toward the water. Sometimes that footage becomes the only witness to what happened, the only thing investigators have to work with, the only record of a person's final minutes. Here are 5 of the most horrifying outdoors deaths ever recorded. It was November 23, 1998, at the Leaning Tower, a sheer granite formation in Yosemite National Park, California. Dan Osman was 35 years old, and he had spent most of his adult life looking for ways to fall on purpose. Osman was a free soloist by trade, a climber who scaled rock faces without ropes or protection, trusting nothing but his own hands and feet hundreds of feet above the ground. But he was best known for inventing something the climbing world had never quite seen before. He called it rope jumping, and it was exactly what it sounded like. He would rig a system of dynamic climbing ropes, the kind designed to stretch and absorb force, anchor them to a cliff, and then leap off the edge into open air. Instead of stopping his fall a few feet down the way a safety rope normally would, his rigging let him free fall for hundreds of feet before the ropes gently caught him and swung him out over the valley. He was not base jumping. There was no parachute. He was deliberately throwing himself off cliffs and engineering the rope system to save his life at the last possible moment. He got very good at it. His personal record was a free fall of more than 1,000 feet, a distance that takes long enough to fall that a person has time to think about it on the way down. To watch him do it was to watch someone treat gravity as a toy. His exploits were filmed and released in a climbing video series called Masters of Stone, and the footage made him a legend in the sport. A man who had apparently found a way to cheat the one force no climber escapes. The rig at the Leaning Tower was the most ambitious system he had ever built. To stretch his jumps to record lengths, he and several friends had strung a roughly 200 feet long between the Leaning Tower and a smaller outcrop called 5 buttress, a kind of high tightrope that let his vertical jumps grow from around 600 feet to more than 1,000. He had come to Yosemite late in October specifically to chase a record, and he had been camped on the project for weeks. The ropes had been rigged at the site for an unusually long time, left exposed to the elements through rain and snow for over a month before his final jump. On November 23rd, with autumn dusk closing in, Osman tied in another rope, changed his entry position, and went for a jump longer than any he had ever made, aiming for a fall of nearly 300 feet. It should have been within his abilities. It was not. They never caught him. The main rope was severed in the air. The failure was investigated by the National Park Service with help from a quality assurance specialist at a major climbing equipment company. The conclusion was that a change in the angle of the jump had set up a fatal sequence. Osman's main jump rope was actually several ropes tied together, and as he fell, the line crossed over itself and caught against one of those knots. At the speed he was traveling, the friction of one rope dragging across another generated enormous heat in an instant. The rope did not simply snap, it was cut and melted through by the friction of his own fall. The very system designed to save him, turning into the thing that killed him. The weeks of exposure to rain and snow may have weakened the ropes further, though it was the geometry of that final jump, the new angle and the catching knot that the investigation centered on. A witness heard him scream, then a crash. Osman fell the full distance to the ground and died from massive trauma. The man who had survived more than 1,000 jumps, who had fallen further on purpose than almost anyone alive, was killed by a jump that came apart in the air. Because his work had been so thoroughly filmed over the years, the world already had hours of footage of him doing the exact thing that finally killed him, leaping off cliffs into nothing. The investigation into his death became, in part, a study of the equipment and the physics, an attempt to understand how a setup that had worked so many times had failed on that particular afternoon. The answer came down to angles, friction, and a length of rope that had been left out in the weather too long. It was the evening of May 16, 2015, at Taft Point, a high overlook on the rim of Yosemite Valley in California. Dean Potter was 43 years old and one of the most famous climbers in the world. With him was Graham Hunt, 29, his regular flying partner. By the end of the night, both of them were dead at the base of the cliff. Potter was not an ordinary climber. Over a long career, he had become a kind of one-man catalog of dangerous outdoor disciplines. He free-soloed, he set speed records on big walls, he walked high lines strung between rock formations thousands of feet up without a net, and he flew wingsuits, the webbed jumpsuits that let a person glide through the air like a flying squirrel after leaping from a height. He was a polarizing figure in Yosemite, admired for pushing every one of those disciplines further than almost anyone, and criticized by the park itself, which considered base jumping and wingsuit flying inside Yosemite illegal. He had built a public persona around moving through the most exposed terrain on Earth with what looked to outsiders like impossible calm. Hunt was younger, but deeply experienced in his own right, a respected base jumper and Potter's regular flying partner. The two men flew together often. They knew the terrain at Taft Point. They knew the line they intended to take. Wingsuit base jumping is widely regarded as one of the most dangerous activities a person can pursue, with a fatality rate far higher than ordinary skydiving, precisely because the pilot flies close to the terrain rather than away from it. The margin for error is measured in feet, and the ground is always right there. That evening, as the light was fading, the two of them put on their wingsuits and prepared to jump. The plan was a flight that demanded near-perfect precision. They would launch off the cliff and fly down through a notch, a gap in the ridgeline of rock, threading the suits through an opening in the terrain before continuing out over open air. It was the kind of line that left almost no margin. A wingsuit pilot aiming for a notch has to be exactly where they intend to be, because the rock does not move. Both men jumped. Both men struck the rock wall. Neither one deployed his parachute. They died on impact. When the two failed to make their planned rendezvous after the flight, Potter's partner on the ground grew worried, and a search began. What investigators eventually recovered told the story in a way few outdoor deaths ever are. Potter had strapped a small action camera to the back of his head, and he had hit record before he leaped. The footage, recovered from the device, showed the flight from his point of view, with Hunt visible behind him in the air. It ran for roughly 22 seconds. It stopped at the moment of impact. That short clip, along with photographs taken by a spotter who had been positioned to watch the jump, became the core of the investigation. Officials studied the footage frame by frame, trying to understand what had gone wrong on a flight both men had the skill to make. They could see the launch, the flight, the approach. What they could not fully explain was why two highly experienced pilots, on a line they knew, both struck the wall within moments of each other. The death was ruled accidental, and the exact cause was described as a mystery. The bodies, lying in steep terrain at the base of the cliff, were recovered by helicopter the following day. Potter's death sent a particular shock through the climbing and base jumping communities, because he had been one of the most visible faces of those sports, a man whose entire reputation rested on the idea that this kind of flying could be done with control, that two pilots of his and Hunt's caliber could both die on the same flight, on a line they understood, underscored how little margin the discipline actually allows. Potter had spent years being filmed doing things that terrified people who watched from solid ground. In the end, the camera on his own head recorded the one flight he did not walk away from, and then it simply stopped. It was June 7th, 2016, in the Norris Geyser Basin of Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. Colin Scott was 23 years old, visiting from Oregon with his sister Sable. They had come to see one of the strangest landscapes on the continent, and they walked off the path into a part of it that is restricted for a reason. Yellowstone sits on top of a supervolcano, and the Norris Geyser Basin is the hottest and one of the most acidic thermal areas in the entire park. The ground there is a thin crust over a network of springs and vents. Some of the water in those springs exceeds 199 degrees Fahrenheit, around 93 degrees Celsius, and it is acidic enough to be genuinely corrosive. The boardwalks that wind through the basin exist not for convenience, but for survival. The crust off the path can be deceptively fragile, and what looks like solid ground can give way to scalding water beneath. Signs throughout the area warn visitors in plain language to stay on the boardwalk. That day, Colin and Sable left it. They walked several hundred feet off the boardwalk and up a slope into the restricted thermal area. According to the park's account, they were looking for a spot to hot pot, the informal and illegal practice of finding a natural hot spring warm enough to soak in. It is a thing some visitors do quietly in parts of the American West, and at Yellowstone it is both against the rules and, in the Norris Basin in particular, close to suicidal. The waters there are not the mild mineral-warm pools people imagine. They are among the most extreme on the planet, and the basin has a long history of severe burns and deaths among people who left the boardwalk. Sable was filming their walk on a phone as they went, recording the two of them moving across the steaming, off-limits ground. Colin crouched down at the edge of a hot spring to reach in and test the temperature of the water. He slipped. He fell into the spring, into water that was both superheated and acidic. His sister was right there and could do nothing. She could not reach him, could not pull him out of water that would have burned anyone who touched it. There was no cell service where they were standing. She had to leave him and go for help. By the time park rangers were able to reach the location, the situation had already passed beyond any hope of recovery. A lightning storm was moving in, and the combination of boiling water and the approaching weather made it impossible to retrieve him safely that day. When officials were able to assess the scene, what they found was almost beyond comprehension. The acidic, superheated water had dissolved his body within roughly a day. There was nothing left to recover. His wallet and his flip-flops were found at the edge of the spring. That was all. The phone video his sister had taken was reviewed by investigators as part of the report into what happened, documenting the walk that led to the edge of the spring. Colin Scott's cause of death was recorded as thermal and chemical injury. His body was never recovered because the ground he had stepped onto had taken it completely. It was June 21st, 2025, on Mount Rinjani, an active volcano rising 3,126 meters on the island of Lombok, Indonesia. Juliana Marins was 26 years old, a Brazilian publicist on a backpacking trip across Southeast Asia. She was hiking Rinjani in a group of 7, climbing toward one of the most popular and most punishing summit routes in the region. Rinjani is a serious mountain, the second highest volcano in Indonesia, and one of the most popular trekking destinations in the country, which draws thousands of hikers a year despite a reputation for difficulty. The trail to its crater rim is steep, exposed, and physically draining, and the upper section is a narrow path along loose volcanic scree with severe drop-offs on either side. Hikers attempt the final push in the dark to reach the summit by sunrise, which adds cold and fatigue to already dangerous ground. The combination of altitude, exhaustion, and a knife-edge trail of shifting sand has caught out experienced trekkers before. By the early hours of June 21st, Juliana was exhausted. She told the others she needed to rest, and the group went on ahead, leaving her alone near the crater rim. She was left by herself for over an hour. At some point during that rest, on the narrow path along the rim, she slipped. She fell down extremely steep terrain. Early estimates put the fall at around 300 meters, though she was later found considerably further down, closer to 600 meters below the rim. And here the story took the turn that would make it international news. Other hikers on the mountain flew a drone over the area where she had gone down, and the drone footage found her. She was alive. She was conscious. The video showed her moving far below the trail after the initial fall. That footage spread around the world and set off a wave of outrage. Here was a young woman, visibly alive on camera, stranded on the side of a volcano, and the rescue was not reaching her. Thick fog rolled across the mountain. The terrain was nearly impossible for rescuers to descend safely. The effort stalled for days, while her family in Brazil and millions of strangers online watched and waited and demanded faster action. but the medical findings that emerged later complicated the story the world had been telling itself. The widely shared belief was that Juliana lay stranded and alive for days, fully aware, slowly waiting for a rescue that never came in time. The most carefully reported version of the evidence does not support that grim picture. A thermal drone eventually located her body near the crater wall. She was confirmed dead on June 24th, her body recovered and later repatriated to Brazil. An autopsy concluded she had died from fractures with internal hemorrhaging consistent with a fall, with death following roughly 20 minutes after the fatal trauma, and found no sign of hypothermia, the slow death from cold that many had assumed she suffered. The picture is not entirely clean. A second autopsy conducted in Brazil was reported to suggest she may have survived far longer after her initial slip, perhaps many hours, before a later fall caused the fatal injuries. The two accounts do not fully agree, and the exact length of time she was alive on the mountain remains contested. What is clear is that the simple, horrifying narrative that spread online of a conscious woman waiting days to be saved oversimplified a sequence that was both more confusing and, in its own way, no less tragic. The drone that filmed her moving had captured a real window in which she was alive, and the rescue, slowed by fog and unstable terrain, did not reach her in time. What endured from the case was the footage of a conscious young woman on a volcano, and the long, public argument over how a hiker left alone to rest for an hour came to fall so far, and why help took as long as it did to reach the place she had fallen. It was September 18, 2023, on a beach near Aquila, in the coastal state of Michoacán, Mexico, on the country's Pacific shore. It was an ordinary afternoon at the water that turned, in the space of a single second, into one of the most widely shared videos of a sudden death anywhere. The weather along the coast had been deteriorating, the sky darkening as a storm pushed in toward the beach. People were beginning to pack up and leave the sand, the way beachgoers do when the air changes and the first sense of a coming storm arrives. A bystander was filming. In the footage, 4 people are visible near the water as the scene unfolds, some of them gathering their things, one packing up against the worsening weather. There is a thunderclap. A second later, a single enormous bolt of lightning comes down. The strike hit one person directly as they were walking away from the water. The electrical current did not stop there. It traveled across the wet sand and struck a second person standing nearby. On camera, both of them collapse in the same instant as the people around them scatter and scream. The 2 victims were a woman, reported to be a tourist, and a man who sold hammocks along the coast. The woman was killed where she stood instantly. The man survived the initial strike and was taken to a hospital, where he later died of his injuries during treatment. The video, captured by a bystander on the beach, spread rapidly across social media in the days that followed and was picked up by news outlets around the world. It became a stark, unedited document of how fast a beach can turn lethal. Lightning is one of the oldest natural killers there is, and an open shoreline during a storm is among the most exposed places a person can be. There is no shelter on an open beach, no high ground or tall structure to draw the strike elsewhere, and the human body standing on flat, wet sand becomes one of the highest points around. The danger that this footage made so visible is one that meteorologists warn about constantly. Lightning can travel well ahead of the rain, striking from a part of the sky that still looks clear, which is why the standard safety guidance is to leave open ground at the very first sound of thunder rather than waiting for the storm to arrive overhead. The 2 people on that beach were doing what feels natural, gathering their belongings and getting ready to move in the moments when they were most exposed. The footage required no investigation to interpret. It showed, in real time, exactly what happened. 2 strangers on a beach struck by the same event, the current branching across the wet sand to take a second life it was never aiming for. The detail that the electricity jumped from one victim to another is what makes the video so disturbing, because it shows something most people do not understand about lightning, that you do not have to be the thing it hits to be killed by it. Standing near a strike on conductive ground can be enough. For all the safety that modern weather forecasting offers, lightning still kills people every year who simply did not get off the open ground in time. The video from Aquila is a few seconds long. It is enough. The outdoors does not negotiate. It does not recognize experience or caution or the difference between a world-famous climber and a tourist packing up an umbrella, a rope left in the rain, a notch in a ridgeline, a thin crust over boiling water, an hour resting alone on a volcano, a storm rolling in over a beach. In every one of these cases the camera was running, and in every one of them it recorded the same thing, the moment the wild stopped being beautiful and became the last place a person ever stood.